Beautiful Joe, an Autobiography by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 31. In the Cow Stable.
"Isn't it a strange thing,"
said Miss Laura,
"that a little thing like a fly can cause so much annoyance to animals as well as to people? Sometimes when I am trying to get more sleep in the morning, their little feet tickle me so that I am nearly frantic and have to fly out of bed."
"You shall have some netting to put over your bed," said Mrs. Wood. "But suppose, Laura, you had no hands to brush away the flies. Suppose your whole body was covered with them, and you were tied up somewhere and could not get loose. I can't imagine more exquisite torture myself. Last summer the flies were dreadful. It seems to me that they are getting worse and worse every year, and worry the animals more. I believe it is because the birds are getting thinned out all over the country. There are not enough of them to catch the flies. John says that the next improvements we make on the farm are to be wire gauze at all the stable windows, and screen doors to keep the little pests from the horses and cattle. One afternoon last summer Mr. Maxwell's mother came for me to go for a drive with her. The heat was so intense, and when we got down by the river, she proposed getting out of the phaeton and sitting under the trees to see if it would be any cooler. She was driving a horse that she had got from the hotel in the village, a roan horse that was clipped and check-reined and had his tail docked. I wouldn't drive behind a tailless horse now. Then I wasn't so particular. However, I made her unfasten the check-rein before I'd set foot in the carriage. Well, I thought that horse would go mad. He'd tremble and shiver and look so pitifully at us. The flies were nearly eating him up. Then he'd start a little. Mrs. Maxwell had a weight at his head to hold him, but he could easily have dragged that. He was a good disposition horse, and he didn't want to run away, but he could not stand still. I soon jumped up and slapped him, and rubbed him till my hands were dripping wet. The poor brute was so grateful, and would keep touching my arm with his nose. Mrs. Maxwell sat under the trees, fanning herself and laughing at me, but I didn't care. How could I enjoy myself with a dumb creature writhing in pain before me? A docked horse can neither eat nor sleep comfortably in the fly season. In one of our New England villages they have a sign up, "Horses taken in to grass. Long tails, $1.50. Short tails, $1. And it just means that the short-tailed ones are taken cheaper, because they are so bothered by the flies that they can't eat much, while the long-tailed ones are able to brush them away and eat in peace. I read the other day of a Buffalo coal dealer's horse that was in such an agony through flies that he committed suicide. You know animals will do that. I've read of horses and dogs drowning themselves. This horse had been clipped and its tail was docked, and he was turned out to graze. The flies stung him till he was nearly crazy. He ran up to a picket fence and sprang up on the sharp spikes. There he hung, making no effort to get down. Some men saw him, and they said it was a clear case of suicide. I would like to have the power to take every man who cuts off a horse's tail, and tie his hands, and turn him out in a field in the hot sun, with little clothing on, and plenty of flies about. Then we would see if he wouldn't sympathize with the poor dumb beast. It's the most senseless thing in the world, this docking fashion. They've a few flimsy arguments about a horse with a docked tail being stronger backed, like a short-tailed sheep, but I don't believe a word of it. The horse was made strong enough to do the work he's got to do, and man can't improve on him. Docking is a cruel, wicked thing. Now there's a ghost of an argument in favor of check-reins on certain occasions. A fiery young horse can't run away with an overdrawn check, and in speeding horses a tight check rein will make them hold their heads up and keep them from choking. But I don't believe in raising colts in a way to make them fiery, and I wish there wasn't a race horse on the face of the earth, so if it depended on me, every kind of check rein would go. It's a pity we women can't vote, Laura. We do away with a good many abuses." Miss Laura smiled, but it was a very faint, almost an unhappy smile, and Mrs. Wood said hastily, "Let us talk about something else. Did you ever hear that cows will give less milk on a dark day than on a bright one?"
No, I never did,
said Miss Laura. "Well, they do. They are most sensitive animals. One finds out all manners of curious things about animals if he makes a study of them. Cows are wonderful creatures, I think, and so grateful for good usage that they return every scrap of care given them with interest. Have you ever heard anything about dehorning, Laura?"
Not much, Auntie. Does Uncle approve of it?
No, indeed. He'd just as soon think of cutting their tails off as dehorning them. He says he guesses the Creator knew how to make a cow better than he does. Sometimes I tell John that his argument doesn't hold good, for a man in some ways can improve on nature. In the natural course of things, a cow would be feeding her calf for half a year, but we take it away from her and raise it as well as she could, and get an extra quantity of milk from her in addition. I don't know what to think myself about dehorning. Mr. Wyndham's cattle are all polled, and he has an open space in his barn for them, instead of keeping them in stalls, and he says they're more comfortable and not so confined. I suppose in sending cattle to sea, it's necessary to take their horns off, but when they're going to be turned out to grass, it seems like mutilating them. Our cows couldn't keep the dogs away from the sheep if they didn't have their horns. Their horns are their means of defense."
Do your cattle stand in these stalls all winter?
asked Miss Laura. "Oh, yes, except when they're turned out in the barnyard, and then John usually has to send a man to keep them moving, or they'd take cold. Sometimes on very fine days they get out all day. You know, cows are not like horses. John says they're like great milk machines. You've got to keep them quiet, only exercising enough to keep them in health. If a cow is hurried or worried or chilled or heated, it stops her milk yield, and bad usage poisons it. John says you can't take a stick and strike a cow across the back without her milk being that much worse. And as for drinking the milk that comes from a cow that isn't kept clean, you'd better throw it away and drink water. When I was in Chicago, my sister-in-law kept complaining to her milkman about what she called the cowy smell to her milk. "It's the animal odor, ma'am," he said, "and it can't be helped. All milk smells like that." "It's dirt," I said, when she asked my opinion about it. "I'll wager my best bonnet that that man's cows are kept dirty. Their skins are plastered up with filth, and as the poison in them can't escape that way, it's coming out through the milk, and you're helping dispose of it." She was astonished to hear this, and she got her milkman's address, and one day dropped in upon him. She said that his cows were standing in a stable that was comparatively clean, but that their bodies were in just the state that I described them living in. She advised the man to card and brush his cows every day, and said that he need bring her no more milk. That shows you how city people are imposed upon with regard to your milk. I should think you'd be poisoned with the treatment your cows receive, and even when your milk is examined, you can't tell whether it's pure or not. In New York, the law only requires 13% of solids in milk. That's absurd, for you can feed a cow on swill and still get 14% of solids in it. Oh, you city people are queer." Miss Laura laughed heartily.
What a prejudice you have against large towns, Auntie.
"Yes, I have," said Miss Wood honestly. "I often wish we could break up a few of our cities and scatter the people through the country. Look at all the lovely farms all about here, some of them with only an old man and woman on them. The boys are off to the cities, slaving in stores and offices, and growing pale and sickly. It would have broken my heart if Harry had taken to city ways. I had a plain talk with your uncle when I married him, and said, 'Now my boy's only a baby, and I want him to be brought up so that he will love country life. How are we going to manage it?' Your uncle looked at me with a sly twinkle in his eye, and said I was a pretty fair specimen of a country girl. Suppose we brought up Harry the way I'd been brought up. I knew he was only joking, yet I got quite excited. 'Yes,' I said, 'do as my father and mother did. Have a farm about twice as large as you can manage. Don't keep a hired man. Get up at daylight and slave till dark. Never take a holiday. Have the girls do the housework and take care of the hens, and help pick the fruit, and make the boys tend the colts and the calves, and put all the money they make in the bank. Don't take any papers, for they would waste their time reading them, and it's too far to go to the post office oftener than once a week. But I don't remember the rest of what I said. Anyway, your uncle burst into a roar of laughter. 'Hattie,' he said, 'my farm's too big. I'm going to sell some of it and enjoy myself a little more.' That very week he sold 50 acres, and he hired an extra man and got me a good girl, and twice a week he left his work in the afternoon and took me for a drive. Harry held the reins in his tiny fingers, and John told him that Dolly, the old mare we were driving, should be called his, and the very next horse he bought should be called his too, and he should name it and have it for his own, and he would give him 5 sheep, and he should have his own bank book and keep his accounts. And Harry understood, mere baby though he was, and from that day he loved John as his own father. If my father had had the wisdom that John has, his boys wouldn't be the one a poor lawyer and the other a poor doctor in 2 different cities, and our farm wouldn't be in the hands of strangers. It makes me sick to go there. I think of my poor mother lying with her tired hands crossed out in the churchyard, and the boys so far away, and my father always hurrying and driving us. I can tell you, Laura, the thing cuts both ways. It isn't all the fault of the boys that they leave the country." Mrs. Wood was silent for a little while after she made this long speech, and Miss Laura said nothing. I took a turn or two up and down the stable, thinking of many things. No matter how happy human beings seem to be, they always have something to worry them. I was sorry for Mrs. Wood, for her face had lost the happy look it usually wore. However, she soon forgot her trouble and said, "Now I must go and get the tea. This is Adele's afternoon out."
"I'll come too,"
said Miss Laura,
"for I promised her I'd make the biscuits for tea this evening and let you rest."
They both sauntered slowly down the plank walk to the house, and I followed them. Chapter 32. Our Return Home. In October, the most beautiful of all the months, we were obliged to go back to Fairport. Miss Laura could not bear to leave the farm, and her face got very sorrowful when anyone spoke of her going away. Still, she had gotten well and strong, and was as brown as a berry, and she said that she knew she ought to go home and get back to her lessons. Mr. Wood called October the golden month. Everything was quiet and still, and at night and in the morning the sun had a yellow, misty look. The trees in the orchard were loaded with fruit, and some of the leaves were floating down, making a soft covering on the ground. In the garden there were a great many flowers in bloom, in flaming red and yellow colors. Miss Laura gathered bunches of them every day to put in the parlor. One day when she was arranging them, she said regretfully,
"They will soon be gone. I wish it could always be summer."
"You would get tired of it," said Mr. Harry, who had come up softly behind her. "There's only one place where we could stand perpetual summer, and that's in heaven."
"Do you suppose that it will always be summer there?"
said Miss Laura, turning around and looking at him. "I don't know. I imagine it will be, but I don't think anybody knows much about it. We've got to wait." Miss Laura's eyes fell on me.
"Harry,"
she said,
"do you think that dumb animals will go to heaven?"
"I shall have to say again, I don't know," he replied. "Some people hold that they do. In a Michigan paper the other day I came across one writer's opinion on the subject. He says that among the best people of all ages have been some who believed in the future life of animals. Homer and the later Greeks and some of the Romans and early Christians held this view, the last believing that God sent angels in the shape of birds to comfort sufferers for the faith. St. Francis called the birds and beasts his brothers. Dr. Johnson believed in a future life for animals, as also did Wordsworth, Shelley, Coleridge, Jeremy Taylor, Agassiz, Lamartine, and many Christian scholars. It seems as if they ought to have some compensation for their terrible sufferings in this world. Then to go to heaven, animals would only have to take up the thread of their lives here. Man is a god to the lower creation. Joe worships you much as you worship your Maker. Dumb animals live in and for their masters. They hang on our words and looks, and are dependent on us in almost every way. For my own part, and looking at it from an earthly point of view, I wish with all my heart that we may find our dumb friends in paradise."
"And in the Bible,"
said Miss Laura,
"animals are often spoken of, the dove and the raven, the wolf and the lamb, and the leopard, and the cattle that God says are his, and the little sparrow that can't fall to the ground without our Father's knowing it."
"Still, there's nothing definite about their immortality," said Mr. Harry. "However, we've got nothing to do with that. If it's right for them to be in heaven, we'll find them there. All we have to do now is to deal with the present, and the Bible plainly tells us that a righteous man regardeth the life of his beast."
"I think I would be happier in heaven if dear old Joe were there,"
said Miss Laura, looking wistfully at me.
"He has been such a good dog. Just think how he has loved and protected me. I think I should be lonely without him."
"That reminds me of some poetry, or rather doggerel," said Mr. Harry, "that I cut out of a newspaper for you yesterday." And he drew from his pocket a little slip of paper and read this: "Do doggies gang to heaven, Dad? Will oor auld Donald gang? For noo to take him fader with us wad be maist awful wrang." There was a number of other verses, telling how many kind things old Donald the dog had done for his master's family, and then it closed with these lines: "Withoot our dogs, fodderman, 'twould be an awful sin To leave oor faithful doggie there, he's certain to win in. Oor Donald's no like ither dogs, he'll no be lockit oot. If Donald's no let into heaven, I'll no gang there one foot." "My sentiments exactly," said a merry voice behind Miss Laura and Mr. Harry, and looking up they saw Mr. Maxwell. He was holding out one hand to them, and in the other kept back a basket of large pears that Mr. Harry promptly took from him and offered to Miss Laura. "I've been dependent upon animals for the most part of my comfort in this life," said Mr. Maxwell, "and I shan't be happy without them in heaven. I don't see how you would get on without Joe, Miss Morris, and I want my birds, and my snake, and my horse. How can I live without them? They're almost all my life here."
If some animals go to heaven and not others, I think that the dog has the first claim,"
said Miss Laura.
"He's the friend of man, the oldest and the best. Have you ever heard the legend about him and Adam?"
"No," said Mr. Maxwell.
"Well, when Adam was turned out of paradise, all the animals shunned him, and he sat bitterly weeping with his head between his hands, when he felt the soft tongue of some creature gently touching him. He took his hands from his face, and there was a dog that had separated himself from all the other animals, and he was trying to comfort him. He became the chosen friend and companion of Adam, afterward of all men."
"There is another legend," said Mr. Harry, "about our Savior and a dog. Have you ever heard it?" "We'll tell you that later," said Mr. Maxwell, "when we know what it is." Mr. Harry showed his white teeth in an amused smile and began. "Once upon a time our Lord was going through a town with his disciples. A dead dog lay by the wayside, and every one that passed along flung some offensive epithet at him. Eastern dogs are not like our dogs, and seemingly there was nothing good about this loathsome creature. But as our Savior went by, he said gently, 'Pearls cannot equal the whiteness of his teeth.'"
"What was the name of that old fellow?"
said Mr. Maxwell abruptly. "Who had a beautiful swan that came every day for 15 years to bury its head in his bosom and feed from his hand, and who would go near no other human being."
"St. Hugh of Lincoln. We heard about him at the Band of Mercy the other day,"
said Miss Laura.
"I should think that he would have wanted to have that swan in heaven with him," said Mr. Maxwell. "What a beautiful creature it must have been. Speaking about animals going to heaven, I dare say some of them would object to going on account of the company that they would meet there. Think of the dog kicked to death by his master, the horse driven into his grave, the thousands of cattle starved to death on the plains. Will they want to meet their owners in heaven?" "According to my reckoning, their owners won't be there," said Mr. Harry. "I firmly believe that the Lord will punish every man or woman who ill treats a dumb creature, just as surely as he will punish those who ill treat their fellow creatures. If a man's life has been a long series of cruelty to dumb animals, do you suppose that he would enjoy himself in heaven, which will be full of kindness to every one? Not he. He'd rather be in the other place, and there he'll go, I fully believe." "When you've quite disposed of all your fellow creatures and the dumb creation, Harry, perhaps you will condescend to go out into the orchard to see how your father is getting on with picking the apples," said Mrs. Wood, joining Miss Laura and the other two men, her eyes twinkling and sparkling with amusement. "The apples will keep, mother," said Mr. Harry, putting his arm around her. "I just came in for a moment to get Laura. Come, Maxwell, we'll all go." "And not another word about animals," Mrs. Wood called after them. "Laura will go crazy some day through thinking of their sufferings if someone doesn't do something to stop her." Miss Laura turned around suddenly. "Dear Aunt Hattie," she said, "you must not say that. I am a coward, I know, about hearing of animals' pains, but I must get over it. I want to know how they suffer. I ought to know, for when I get to be a woman, I am going to do all that I can to help them."
"And I'll join you," said Mr. Max Whale, stretching out his hand to Miss Laura. She did not smile, but looking very earnestly at him, she held it clasped in her own.
"You will help me to care for them, will you?"
she said. "Yes, I promise," he said gravely. "I'll give myself to the service of dumb animals, if you will." "And I, too," said Mr. Harry in his deep voice, laying his hand across theirs. Mrs. Wood stood looking at their three fresh, eager young faces with tears in her eyes. Just as they all stood silently for an instant, the old village clergyman came into the room from the hall. He must have heard what they said, for before he could move, he had laid his hands on their three brown heads. "Bless you, my children," he said. "God will lift up the light of his countenance upon you, for you have given yourselves to a noble work. In serving dumb creatures, you are ennobling the human race." Then he sat down in a chair and looked at them. He was a venerable old man, and had long white hair, and the Woods thought a great deal of him. He had come to get Mrs. Wood to make some nourishing dishes for a sick woman in the village, and while he was talking to her, Miss Laura and the two young men went out of the house. They hurried across the veranda and over the lawn, talking and laughing, and enjoying themselves as only happy young people can, and with not a trace of their seriousness of a few moments before on their faces. They were going so fast that they ran right into a flock of geese that were coming up the lane. They were driven by a little boy called Tommy, the son of one of Mr. Wood's farm laborers, and they were chattering and gabbling, and seemed very angry. "What's all this about?" said Mr. Harry, stopping and looking at the boy. "What's the matter with your feathered charges, Tommy, my lad?" "If it's the geese you mean," said the boy, half crying and looking very much put out, "it's all them nasty potatoes. They won't keep away from them." "So the potatoes chase the geese, do they?" said Mr. Maxwell teasingly.
"No, no," said the child pettishly. "Mr. Wood, he sets me to watch the geese, and then they runs in among the buckwheat and the potatoes, and I tries to drive them out, but they doesn't want to come, and," shamefacedly, "I has to switch their feet, and I hate to do it, 'cause I'm a Band of Mercy boy." "Tommy, my son," said Mr. Maxwell solemnly, "you will go right to heaven when you die, and your geese will go with you." "Hush, hush," said Miss Laura. "Don't tease him." And putting her arm on the dear child's shoulder, she said, "You are a good boy, Tommy, not to want to hurt the geese. Let me see your switch, dear." He showed her a little stick he had in his hand, and she said, "I don't think you could hurt them much with that, and if they will be naughty and steal the potatoes, you have to drive them out. Take some of my pears and eat them, and you will forget your trouble." The child took the fruit, and Miss Laura and the two young men went on their way, smiling, and looking over their shoulders at Tommy, who stood in the lane devouring his pears, and keeping one eye on the geese that had gathered a little in front of him, and were gabbling noisily, and having a kind of indignation meeting, because they had been driven out of the potato field. Tommy's father and mother lived in a little house down near the road. Mr. Wood never had his hired men live in his own house. He had two small houses for them to live in,
and they were required to keep them as neat as Mr. Wood's own house was kept. He said he didn't see why he should keep a boarding house if he was a farmer, nor why his wife should wear herself out waiting on strong, hearty men that had just as soon take care of themselves. He wished to have his own family about him, and it was better for his men to have some kind of family life for themselves. If one of his men was unmarried, he boarded with the married one, but slept in his own house. On this October day, we found Mr. Wood hard at work under the fruit trees. He had a good many different kinds of apples, enormous red ones, and long yellow ones that they called pippins, and little brown ones, and smooth-coated sweet ones, and bright red ones, and others, more than I could mention. Miss Laura often pared one and cut off little bits for me, for I always wanted to eat whatever I saw her eating. Just a few days after this, Miss Laura and I returned to Fairport, and some of Mr. Wood's apples traveled along with us, for he sent a good many to the Boston market. Mr. and Mrs. Wood came to the station to see us off. Mr. Harry could not come, for he had left Riverdale the day before to go back to his college. Mrs. Wood said that she would be very lonely without her two young people, and she kissed Miss Laura over and over again, and made her promise to come back again in the next summer. I was put in a box in the express car, and Mr. Wood told the agent that if he knew what was good for him, he would speak to me occasionally, for I was a very knowing dog, and if he didn't treat me well, I'd be apt to write him up in the newspapers. The agent laughed, and quite often on the way to Fairport, he came to my box and spoke kindly to me, so I did not get so lonely and frightened as I did on my way to Riverdale. How glad the Morrises were to see us coming back. The boys had all gotten home before us, and such a fuss they made over their sister. They loved her dearly and never wanted her to be long away from them. I was rubbed and stroked, and had to run about offering my paw to every one. Jim and little Billy licked my face, and Bella croaked out,
"Glad to see you, Joe. Had a good time? How's your health?"
We soon settled down for the winter. Miss Laura began going to school, and came home every day with a pile of books under her arm. The summer in the country had done her so much good that her mother often looked at her fondly, and said the white-faced child she sent away had come home a nut-brown maid. Chapter 33. Performing Animals. A week or two after we got home, I heard the Morris boys talking about an Italian who was coming to Fairport with a troop of trained animals, and I could see for myself, whenever I went to town, great flaming pictures on the fences of monkeys sitting at tables, dogs and ponies and goats climbing ladders and rolling balls and doing various tricks. I wondered very much whether they would be able to do all those extraordinary things, but it turned out that they did. The Italian's name was Bellini, and one afternoon the whole Morris family went to see him and his animals, and when they came home I heard them talking about it. "I wish you could have been there, Joe," said Jack, pulling up my paws to rest on his knees. "Now listen, old fellow, and I'll tell you all about it. First of all, there was a perfect jam in the town hall. I sat up in front with a lot of fellows, and had a splendid view. The old Italian came out dressed in his best suit of clothes, black broadcloth, flower in his buttonhole, and so on. He made a fine bow, and he said he was pleased to see the fine audience, and he was going to show them the fine animals, the finest animals in the world. Then he shook a little whip that he carried in his hand, and he said that whip didn't mean he was cruel. He cracked it to show his animals when to begin, end, or change their tricks. Some boy yelled, "Rats, you do whip them sometimes." And the old man made another bow and said, "Certainly, he whipped them just as these mammas whipped the naughty boys, to make them keep still when they was noisy or stubborn." Then everybody laughed at the boy, and the Italian said the performance would begin by a grand procession of all the animals, if some lady would kindly step up to the piano and play a march. Nina Smith, you know Nina, Joe, the girl that has black eyes and wears blue ribbons and lives around the corner, stepped up to the piano and banged out a fine loud march. The doors at the side of the platform opened, and out came the animals, 2 by 2, just like Noah's Ark. There was a pony with a monkey walking beside it and holding on to its mane, and another monkey on a pony's back, 2 monkeys hand in hand, a dog with a parrot on his back, a goat harnessed to a little carriage, another goat carrying a bird cage in its mouth with 2 canaries inside, different kinds of cats, some doves and pigeons, half a dozen white rats with red harness, and dragging a little chariot with a monkey in it, and a common white gander that came in last of all, and did nothing but follow one of the ponies about. The Italian spoke of the gander, and said it was a stupid creature, and could learn no tricks, and he only kept it on account of its affection for the pony. He had got them both on a Vermont farm, and he was looking for show animals. The pony's master had made a pet of him, and had taught him to come whenever he whistled for him. Though the pony was only a stub of a creature, he had a gentle disposition, and every other animal on the farm liked him. A gander, in particular, had such an admiration for him that he followed him wherever he went, and if he lost him for an instant, he would mount one of the knolls on the farm and stretch out his neck looking for him. When he caught sight of him, he gabbled with delight, running to him, waddled up and down beside him. Every little white pony put his nose down, and seemed to be having a conversation with the goose. If the farmer whistled for the pony, and he started to run to him, the gander, knowing he could not keep up, would seize the pony's tail in his beak, and flapping his wings, would get along as fast as the pony did, and the pony never kicked him. The Italian saw that this pony would be a good one to train for the stage, so he offered the farmer a large price for him, and took him away. Oh, Joe, I forgot to say that by this time all the animals had been sent off the stage except the pony and the gander, and they stood looking at the Italian while he talks. I never saw anything as human in dumb animals as that pony's face. He looked as if he understood every word that his master was saying. After this story was over, the Italian made another bow, and then told the pony to bow. He nodded his head at the people, and they all laughed. Then the Italian asked him to favor us with a walk, and the pony got up on his hind legs and danced. You should have seen that gander skirmishing around, so as to be near the pony, and yet keep out of the way of his heels. We fellows just roared, and we would have kept him dancing all the afternoon, if the Italian hadn't begged the young gentleman not to make the noise, but let the pony do the rest of his tricks. Pony number 2 came on the stage, and it was too queer for anything to see the things the 2 of them did. They helped the Italian on with his coat, They pulled off his rubbers. They took his coat away and brought him a chair and dragged a table up to it. They brought him letters and papers, and rang bells, and rolled barrels, and swung the Italian in a big swing, and jumped a rope, and walked up and down steps. They just went around that stage as handy with their teeth as two boys would be with their hands, and they seemed to understand every word their master said to them. The best trick of all was telling the time, and doing questions in arithmetic. The Italian pulled his watch out of his pocket and showed it to the first pony, whose name was Diamond, and said, "What time is it?" The pony looked at it, then scratched 4 times with his forefoot on the platform. The Italian said, "That's good, 4 o'clock. But it's a few minutes after 4. How many?" The pony scratched again 5 times. The Italian showed his watch to the audience, and said it was just 5 minutes past 4. Then he asked the pony how old he was. He scratched 4 times. That meant 4 years. He asked him how many days in a week there were, how many months in a year, and he gave him some questions in addition and subtraction, and the pony answered them all correctly. Of course, the Italian was giving him some sign, but though we watched him closely, we couldn't make out what it was. At last, he told the pony that he had been very good and had done his lessons well. If it would rest him, he might be naughty a little while. All of a sudden, a wicked look came into the creature's eyes. He turned around and kicked up his heels at his master. He pushed over the table and chairs, and knocked down a blackboard where he had been rubbing out figures with a sponge held in his mouth. The Italian pretended to be cross and said, "Come, come, this won't do," and he called the other pony to him and told him to take that troublesome fellow off the stage. The second one nosed Diamond and pushed him about, finally bit him by the ear and led him squealing off the stage. The gander followed, gabbling as fast as he could, and there was a regular roar of applause. After that, there were ladders brought in, Joe, and dogs came on. Not thoroughbreds, but curs, something like you. The Italian says he can't teach tricks to pedigree animals as well as to scrubs. Those dogs jumped the ladders and climbed them and went through them and did all kinds of things. The man cracked his whip once and they began. Twice and they did backward what they had done forward. 3 times and they stopped. And every animal, dogs, goats, ponies, and monkeys, after they had finished their tricks, ran up to their master, and he gave them a lump of sugar. They seemed fond of him, and often when they weren't performing, went up to him and licked his hands or his sleeve. There was one boss dog, Joe, with a head like yours. Bob, they called him, and he did all his tricks alone. The Italian went off the stage, and the dog came on and made his bow, and climbed his ladders and jumped his hurdles and went off again. The audience howled for an encore, and didn't he come out alone, make another bow, and retire. I saw old Judge Brown wiping tears from his eyes, he'd laughed so much. One of the last tricks was with a goat, and the Italian said it was the best of all, because the goat is such a hard animal to teach. He had a big ball, and the goat got on it and rolled across the stage without getting off. He looked as nervous as a cat, shaking his old beard, and trying to keep his 4 hoofs close enough together to keep them on the ball. We had a funny little play at the end of the performance. A monkey dressed as a lady in a white satin suit and a bonnet with a white veil came on the stage. She was Miss Green, and the dog, Bob, was going to elope with her. He was all rigged out as Mr. Smith, and had on a light suit of clothes, and a tall hat on the side of his head, high collar, long cuffs, and he carried a cane. He was a regular dude. He stepped up to Miss Green on his hind legs, and helped her on to a pony's back. The pony galloped off the stage. Then a crowd of monkeys, chattering and wringing their hands, came on. Mr. Smith had run away with their child. They were all dressed up, too. There were the father and mother, with gray wigs and black clothes, and the young Greens in bibs and tuckers. They were a queer-looking crowd. While they were going on in this way, the pony trotted back on the stage, and they all flew at him and pulled off their daughter from his back, and laughed and chattered and boxed her ears, and took off her white veil and her satin dress, and put on an old brown thing, and some of them seized the dog and kicked his hat and broke his cane and stripped his clothes off, and threw them in a corner and bound his legs with cords. A goat came on, harnessed to a little cart, and they threw the dog in it and wheeled him around the stage a few times. Then they took him out, tied him to a hook in the wall, and the goat ran off the stage, and the monkeys ran to one side, and one of them pulled out a little revolver, pointed it at the dog, and fired, and he dropped down as if he was dead. The monkey stood looking at him, and then there was the most awful hullabaloo you ever heard. Such a barking and yelping, and half a dozen dogs rushed on the stage, and didn't they trundle those monkeys about. They nosed them, and pushed them, and shook them till they all ran away, all but Miss Green, who sat shivering in a corner. After a while she crept up to the dead dog, pawed him a little, and didn't he jump up as much alive as any of them. Everybody in the room clapped and shouted, and then the curtain dropped and the thing was over. I wished he'd give another performance. Early in the morning he has to go to Boston. Jack pushed my paws from his knees and went outdoors, and I began to think that I would very much like to see those performing animals. It was not yet tea time, and I would have plenty of time to take a run down to the hotel where they were staying. So I set out. It was a lovely autumn evening. The sun was going down in a haze, and it was quite warm. Earlier in the day I had heard Mr. Morris say that this was our Indian summer, and that we should soon have cold weather. Fairport was a pretty little town, and from the principal street one could look out upon the blue water of the bay, and see the island opposite, which was quite deserted now, for all the summer visitors had gone home, and the island house was shut up. I was running down one of the steep side streets that led to the water when I met a heavily laden cart coming up. It must have been coming from one of the vessels, for it was full of strange-looking boxes and packages. A fine-looking, nervous horse was drawing it, and he was straining at every nerve to get it up the steep hill. His driver was a burly, hard-faced man, and instead of letting his horse stop a minute to rest, he kept urging him forward. The poor horse kept looking at his master, his eyes almost starting from his head in terror. He knew that the whip was about to descend on his quivering body, and so it did, and there was no one by to interfere. No one but a woman in a ragged shawl, who would have no influence with the driver. There was a very good humane society in Fairport, and none of the teamsters dared ill-use their horses, if any of the members were near. This was a quiet, out-of-the-way street, with only poor houses on it, and the man probably knew that none of the members of the society would be likely to be living in them. He whipped his horse, and whipped him till every lash made my heart ache, and if I had dared, I would have bitten him severely. Suddenly, there was a dull thud in the street. The horse had fallen down. The driver ran to his head, but he was quite dead.
"Thank God,"
said the poorly dressed woman bitterly.
"one more out of this world of misery."
Then she turned and went down the street. I was glad for the horse. He would never be frightened or miserable again. And I went slowly on, thinking that death is the best thing that can happen to tortured animals. The Fairport Hotel was built right in the center of the town, and the shops and houses crowded quite close about it. It was a high brick building, and it was called the Fairport House. As I was running along the sidewalk, I heard someone speak to me, and looking up, I saw Charlie Montague. I had heard the Morrises say that his parents were staying at the hotel a few weeks while their house was being repaired. He had his Irish setter, Brisk, with him, and a handsome dog he was as he stood waving his silky tail in the sunlight. Charlie patted me, and then he and his dog went into the hotel. I turned into the stable yard. It was a small, choked up place, and as I picked my way under the cabs and wagons standing in the yard, I wondered why the hotel people didn't buy some of the old houses nearby and tear them down and make a stable yard worthy of such a nice hotel. The hotel horses were just getting rubbed down after their day's work, and others were coming in. The men were talking and laughing, and there was no sign of strange animals. So I went around to the back of the yard. Here they were, in an empty cow stable under a hay loft. There were 2 little ponies tied up in a stall, 2 goats beyond them, and dogs and monkeys in strong traveling cages. I stood in the doorway and stared at them. I was sorry for the dogs to be shut up on such a lovely evening, but I suppose their master was afraid of their getting lost or being stolen if he let them loose. They all seemed very friendly. The ponies turned around and looked at me with their gentle eyes, and then went on munching their hay. I wondered very much where the gander was, and went a little farther into the stable. Something white raised itself out of the brownest pony's crib, and there was the gander close up beside the open mouth of his friend. The monkeys made a jabbering noise and held on to the bars of their cage with their little black hands while they looked out at me. The dogs sniffed the air and wagged their tails and tried to put up their muzzles through the bars of their cage. I liked the dogs best, and I wanted to see the one they called Bob, so I went up quite close to them. There were 2 little white dogs, something like Billy, 2 mongrel spaniels, an Irish setter, and a brown dog asleep in the corner that I knew must be Bob. He did look a little like me, but he was not quite so ugly, for he had his ears in his tail. While I was peering through the bars at him, a man came into the stable. He noticed me first thing, but instead of driving me out, he spoke kindly to me in a language that I did not understand. So I knew he was the Italian. How glad the animals were to see him. The gander fluttered out of his nest. The ponies pulled at their halters. The dogs whined and tried to reach his hands to lick them, and the monkeys chattered with delight. He laughed and talked back to them in queer, soft-sounding words. Then he took out of a bag on his arm bones for the dogs, nuts and cakes for the monkeys, nice juicy carrots for the ponies, some green stuff for the goats, and corn for the gander. It was a pretty sight to see the old man feeding his pets, and it made me feel quite hungry. So I trotted home. I had a run downtown again that evening with Mr. Morris, who went to get something from a shop for his wife. He never let his boys go to town after tea, so if there were errands to be done, he or Mrs. Morris went. The town was bright and lively that evening, and a great many people were walking about and looking into the shop windows. When we came home, I went into the kennel with Jim, and there I slept till the middle of the night. Then I started up and ran outside. There was a distant bell ringing, which we often heard in Fairport, and which always meant fire. Chapter 34. A Fire in Fairport. I had several times run to a fire with the boys, and knew that there was always a great noise and excitement. There was a light in the house, so I knew that somebody was getting up. I don't think, indeed I know, for they were good boys, that they ever wanted anybody to lose property. But they did enjoy seeing a blaze, and one of their greatest delights, when there hadn't been a fire for some time, was to build a bonfire in the garden. Jim and I ran around to the front of the house and waited. In a few minutes, someone came rattling at the front door, and I was sure it was Jack, but it was Mr. Morris, and without a word to us, he set off, almost running toward the town. We followed after him, and as we hurried along, other men ran out from the houses along the streets, and either joined him or dashed ahead. They seemed to have dressed in a hurry, and were thrusting their arms in their coats, and buttoning themselves up as they went. Some of them had hats, and some of them had none, and they all had their faces toward the great red light that got brighter and brighter ahead of us. "Where's the fire?" they shouted to each other. "Don't know. Afraid it's the hotel or the town hall. It's such a blaze. Hope not. How's the water supply now? Bad time for a fire." It was the hotel. We saw that as soon as we got on to the main street. There were people all about, and a great noise and confusion, and smoke and blackness, and up above, bright tongues of flame were leaping against the sky. Jim and I kept close to Mr. Morris's heels, as he pushed his way among the crowd. When we got nearer the burning building, we saw men carrying ladders and axes, and others were shouting directions and rushing out of the hotel, carrying boxes and bundles and furniture in their arms. From the windows above came a steady stream of articles thrown among the crowd. A mirror struck Mr. Morris on the arm, and a whole package of clothes fell on his head and almost smothered him. But he brushed them aside and scarcely noticed them. There was something the matter with Mr. Morris. I knew by the worried sound of his voice when he spoke to any one. I could not see his face, though it was as light as day about us, for we had got jammed in the crowd, and if I had not kept between his feet, I should have been trodden to death. Jim, being larger than I was, had got separated from us. Presently Mr. Morris raised his voice above the uproar and called, "Is everyone out of the hotel?" A voice shouted back, "I'm going up to see." "It's Jim Watson, the fireman," cried someone near. "He's risking his life to go into that pit of flame. Don't go, Watson." I don't think that brave fireman paid any attention to this warning. for an instant later the same voice said, "He's planting his ladder against the third story. He's bound to go. He'll not get any farther than the second, anyway." "Where are the Montagues?" shouted Mr. Morris. "Has anyone seen the Montagues?"
"Mr. Morris, Mr. Morris,"
said a frightened young voice, and Charles Montague pressed through the people to us.
"Where's Papa?"
"I don't know. Where did you leave him?" said Mr. Morris, taking his hand and drawing him closer to him.
"I was sleeping in his room,"
said the boy.
"and a man knocked at the door and said, 'Hotel on fire, 5 minutes to dress and get out.' And Papa told me to put on my clothes and go downstairs, and he ran up to Mama."
"Where was she?" asked Mr. Morris quickly.
"On the fourth flat. She and her maid Blanche were up there. You know, Mama hasn't been well and couldn't sleep, and our room was so noisy that she moved upstairs where it was quiet."
Mr. Morris gave a kind of groan.
"Oh, I'm so hot, and there's such a dreadful noise,"
said the little boy, bursting into tears.
"And I want Mama."
Mr. Morris soothed him the best he could, and drew him a little to the edge of the crowd. While he was doing this, there was a piercing cry. I could not see the person making it, but I knew it was the Italian's voice. He was screaming in broken English that the fire was spreading to the stables, and his animals would be burned. Would no one help him to get his animals out? There was a great deal of confused language. Some voices shouted, "Look after the people first. Let the animals go." And the others said, "For shame, get the horses out." But no one seemed to do anything, for the Italian went on crying for help. I heard a number of people who were standing near us say that it had just been found out that several persons who had been sleeping in the top of the hotel had not got out. They said that at one of the top windows a poor housemaid was shrieking for help. Here in the street we could see no one at the upper windows, for the smoke was pouring from them. The air was very hot and heavy, and I didn't wonder that Charlie Montague felt ill. He would have fallen on the ground if Mr. Morris hadn't taken him in his arms and carried him out of the crowd. He put him down on the brick sidewalk and unfastened his little shirt and left me to watch him, while he held his hands under a leak in a hose that was fastened to a hydrant near us. He got enough water to dash on Charlie's face and breast, and then, seeing that the boy was reviving, he sat down on the curbstone and took him on his knee. Charlie lay in his arms and moaned. He was a delicate boy, and he could not stand rough usage as the Morris boys could. Mr. Morris was terribly uneasy. His face was deathly white, and he shuddered whenever there was a cry from the burning building. "Poor souls! God help them! Oh, this is awful!" he said. And then he turned his eyes from the great sheets of flame and strained the little boy to his breast. At last there were wild shrieks that I knew came from no human throats. The fire must have reached the horses. Mr. Morris sprang up, then sank back again. He wanted to go, yet he could be of no use. There were hundreds of men standing about, but the fire had spread so rapidly, and they had so little water to put on it, that there was very little they could do. I wondered whether I could do anything for the poor animals. I was not afraid of fire, as most dogs, For one of the tricks that the Morris boys had taught me was to put out a fire with my paws. They would throw a piece of lighted paper on the floor, and I would crush it with my forepaws, and if the blaze was too large for that, I would drag a bit of old carpet over it and jump on it. I left Mr. Morris and ran around the corner of the street to the back of the hotel. It was not burned as much here as in the front, and in the houses all around, people were out on their roofs with wet blankets, and some were standing at the windows watching the fire, or packing up their belongings ready to move if it should spread to them. There was a narrow lane running up a short distance toward the hotel, and I started to go up this, when in front of me I heard such a wailing, piercing noise that it made me shudder and stand still. The Italians' animals were going to be burned up, and they were calling to their master to come let them out. Their voices sounded like the voices of children in mortal pain. I could not stand it. I was seized with such an awful horror of the fire that I turned and ran, feeling so thankful that I was not in it. As I got into the street, I stumbled over something. It was a large bird, a parrot, and at first I thought it was Bella. Then I remembered hearing Jack say that the Italian had a parrot. It was not dead, but seemed stupid with the smoke. I seized it in my mouth and ran and laid it at Mr. Morris's feet. He wrapped it in his handkerchief and laid it beside him. I sat and trembled and did not leave him again. I shall never forget that dreadful night. It seemed as if we were there for hours, but in reality it was only a short time. The hotel soon got to be all red flames, and there was very little smoke. The inside of the building had burned away, and nothing more could be gotten out. The firemen and all the people drew back, and there was no noise. Everybody stood gazing silently at the flames. A man stepped quietly up to Mr. Morris, and looking at him, I saw it was Mr. Montague. He was usually a well-dressed man with a kind face and a head of thick, grayish-brown hair. Now his face was black and grimy, his hair was burnt from the front of his head, and his clothes were half torn from his back. Mr. Morris sprang up when he saw him and said, "Where is your wife?" The gentleman did not say a word, but pointed to the burning building. "Impossible!" cried Mr. Morris. "Is there no mistake? Your beautiful young wife, Montague? Can it be so?" Mr. Morris was trembling from head to foot. "It is true," said Mr. Montague quietly. "Give me the boy." Charlie had fainted again, and his father took him in his arms and turned away. "Montague," cried Mr. Morris, "my heart is sore for you. Can I do nothing?" "No, thank you," said the gentleman, without turning around. But there was more anguish in his voice than in Mr. Morris's, and though I'm only a dog, I knew that his heart was breaking. Chapter 35. Billy and the Italian. Mr. Morris stayed no longer. He followed Mr. Montague along the sidewalk a little way, and then exchanged a few hurried words with some men who were standing near, and hastened home through the streets that seemed dark and dull after the splendor of the fire. Though it was still the middle of the night, Mrs. Morris was up and dressed and waiting for him. She opened the hall door with one hand and held a candle in the other. I felt frightened and miserable, and didn't want to leave Mr. Morris, so I crept in after him. "Don't make a noise," said Mrs. Morris. "Laura and the boys are sleeping, and I thought it better not to wake them. It has been a terrible fire, hasn't it? Was it the hotel?" Mr. Morris threw himself into a chair and covered his face with his hands. "Speak to me, William," said Mrs. Morris in a startled tone. "You are not hurt, are you?" And she put her candle on the table and came and sat down beside him. He dropped his hands from his face, and tears were running down his cheeks. "10 lives lost," he said, "among them Mrs. Montague." Mrs. Morris looked horrified and gave a little cry. "William, it can't be so." It seemed as if Mr. Morris could not sit still. He got up and walked to and fro on the floor. "It was an awful scene, Margaret. I never wish to look upon the like again. Do you remember how I protested against the building of that death trap? Look at the wide open streets around it. And yet they persisted in running it up to the sky. God will require an account of those deaths at the hands of the men who put up that building. It is terrible, this disregard of human lives. To think of that delicate woman and her death agony." He threw himself in a chair and buried his face in his hands. "Where was she? How did it happen? Was her husband saved? And Charlie?" said Mrs. Morris in a broken voice. "Yes, Charlie and Mr. Montague are safe. Charlie will recover from it. Montague's life is done. You know his love for his wife. Oh, Margaret, when will men cease to be fools? What does the Lord think of them when they say, 'Am I my brother's keeper?' And the poor creatures burned to death. Their lives are as precious in his sight as Mrs. Montague's." Mr. Morris looked so weak and ill that Mrs. Morris, like a sensible woman, questioned him no further, but made a fire and got him some hot tea. Then she made him lie down on the sofa, and she sat by him till daybreak, when she persuaded him to go to bed. I followed her about and kept touching her dress with my nose. It seemed so good to me to have this pleasant home, after all the misery I had seen that night. Once she stopped and took my head between her hands. "Dear old Joe," she said tearfully, "this is a suffering world. It's well there's a better one beyond it." In the morning the boys went downtown before breakfast and learned all about the fire. It started in the top story of the hotel, in the room of some fast young men, who were sitting up late playing cards. They had smuggled wine into their room, and had been drinking till they were stupid. One of them upset the lamp, and when the flames began to spread so that they could not extinguish them, instead of rousing someone near them, they rushed downstairs to get someone to come up there and help them put out the fire. When they returned with some of the hotel people, they found that the flames had spread from their room, which was in an L at the back of the house, to the front part, where Mrs. Montague's room was, and where the housemaids belonging to the hotel slept. By this time, Mr. Montague had gotten upstairs, but he found the passageway to his wife's room so full of flames and smoke, that though he tried again and again to force his way through, he could not. He disappeared for a time, Then he came to Mr. Morris and got his boy, and took him to some rooms over his bank, and shut himself up with him. For some days he would let no one in. Then he came out with the look of an old man on his face, and his hair as white as snow, and he went out to his beautiful house in the outskirts of the town. Nearly all the horses belonging to the hotel were burned. A few were gotten out by having blankets put over their heads, but the most of them were so terrified that they would not stir. The Morris boys said that they had found the old Italian sitting on an empty box, looking at the smoking ruins of the hotel. His head was hanging on his breast, and his eyes were full of tears. His ponies were burned up, he said, and the gander, and the monkeys, and the goats, and his wonderful performing dogs. He had only his birds left, and he was a ruined man. He had toiled all his life to get this troop of trained animals together, and now they were swept from him. It was cruel and wicked, and he wished he could die. The canaries and pigeons and doves, the hotel people had allowed him to take to his room, and they were safe. The parrot was lost, an educated parrot that could answer 40 questions, and among other things, could take a watch and tell the time of day. Jack Morris told him that they had it safe at home, and that it was very much alive, quarreling furiously with his parrot Bella. The old man's face brightened at this, and then Jack and Carl, finding that he had had no breakfast, went off to a restaurant near by, and got him some steak and coffee. The Italian was very grateful, and as he ate, Jack said the tears ran into his coffee cup. He told them how much he loved his animals, and how it made the heart bitter to hear them crying to him to deliver them from the raging fire. The boys came home and got their breakfast and went to school. Miss Laura did not go out. She sat all day with a very quiet, pained face. She could neither read nor sew, and Mr. and Mrs. Morris were just as unsettled. They talked about the fire in low tones, and I could see that they felt more sad about Mrs. Montague's death than if she had died in an ordinary way. Her dear little canary, Barry, died with her. She would never be separated from him, and his cage had been taken up to the top of the hotel with her. He probably died an easier death than his poor mistress. Charlie's dog escaped, but was so frightened that he ran out to their house outside the town. At tea time, Mr. Morris went to town to see that the Italian got a comfortable place for the night. When he came back, he said that he had found out that the Italian was by no means so old a man as he looked, and that he had talked to him about raising a sum of money for him among the Fairport people, till he had become quite cheerful, and said that if Mr. Morris would do that, he would try to gather another troop of animals together and train them. "Now what can we do for this Italian?" asked Mrs. Morris. "We can't give him much money, but we might let him have one or two of our pets. There's Billy. He's a bright little dog, and he's not 2 years old yet. He could teach him anything." There was a blank silence among the Morris children. Billy was such a gentle, lovable little dog that he was a favorite with everyone in the house.
I suppose we ought to do it,
said Miss Laura at last.
But how can we give him up?"
There was a good deal of discussion, but the end of it was that Billy was given to the Italian. He came up to get him, and was very grateful, and made a great many bows, holding his hat in his hand. Billy took to him at once, and the Italian spoke so kindly to him that we knew he would have a good master. Mr. Morris got quite a large sum of money for him, and when he handed it to him, the poor man was so pleased that he kissed his hand, and promised to send frequent word as to Billy's progress and welfare. Chapter 36. Dandy the Tramp. About a week after Billy left us, the Morris family, much to its surprise, became the owner of a new dog. He walked into the house one cold, wintry afternoon, and lay calmly down by the fire. He was a brindled bull terrier, and he had on a silver-plated collar with Dandy engraved on it. He lay all the evening by the fire, and when any of the family spoke to him, he wagged his tail and looked pleased. I growled a little at him at first, but he never cared a bit, and just dozed off to sleep, so I soon stopped. He was such a well-bred dog that the Morrises were afraid that someone had lost him. They made some inquiries the next day, and found that he belonged to a New York gentleman who had come to Fairport in the summer in a yacht. This dog did not like the yacht. He came ashore in a boat whenever he got a chance, and if he could not come in a boat, he would swim. He was a tramp, his master said, and he wouldn't stay long in any place. The Morrises were so amused with his impudence that they did not send him away, but said every day, "Surely he will be gone tomorrow." However, Mr. Dandy had gotten into some comfortable quarters, and he had no intention of changing them, for a while at least. Then he was very handsome, and had such a pleasant way with him, that the family could not help liking him. I never cared for him. He fawned on the Morrises, and pretended he loved them, and afterward turned around and laughed and sneered at them in a way that made me very angry. I used to lecture him sometimes, and growl about him to Jim, but Jim always said, "Let him alone. You can't do him any good. He was born bad. His mother wasn't good. He tells me that she had a bad name among all the other dogs in her neighborhood. She was a thief and a runaway." Though he provoked me so often, yet I could not help laughing at some of his stories, they were so funny. We were lying out in the sun on the platform at the back of the house one day, and he had been more than usually provoking, so I got up to leave him. He put himself in my way, however, and said coaxingly, "Don't be cross, old fellow. I'll tell you some stories to amuse you, old boy. What shall they be about?" "I think the story of your life would be about as interesting as anything you could make up," I said dryly. "All right, fact or fiction, whichever you like. Here's a fact, plain and unvarnished. Born and bred in New York. Swell stable, swell coachman, swell master. Jeweled fingers of ladies poking at me, first thing I remember. First painful experience, being sent to vet, to have ears cut." "What's a vet?" I said. "A veterinary animal doctor. Vet. Didn't cut ears, though. Master sent me back. Cut ears again. Summer time and flies bad. Ears got sore and festered. flies very attentive. Coachman set little boy to brush flies off, but he'd run out in the yard and leave me. Flies awful, though they'd eat me up, or else I'd shake out brains trying to get rid of them. Mother should have stayed home and licked my ears, but was cruising about the neighborhood. Finally, Coachman put me in dark place, powdered ears, and they got well. "Why didn't they cut your tail, too?" I said, looking at his long, slim tail, which was like a sewer rat's. "'Twasn't the fashion. Mr. Wayback, a bull terrier's ears are clipped to keep them from getting torn while fighting." "You're not a fighting dog," I said. "Not I. Too much trouble. I believe in taking things easy." "I should think you did," I said scornfully. "You never put yourself out for any one, I notice. But speaking of cropping ears, what do you think of it?" "Well," he said, with a sly glance at my head, "it isn't a pleasant operation, but one might as well be out of the world as out of the fashion. I don't care now. My ears are done." "But," I said, "think of the poor dogs that will come after you." "What difference does that make to me?" he said. "I'll be dead and out of the way. Men can cut off their ears and tails and legs too if they want to." "Dandy," I said angrily. "You're the most selfish dog that I ever saw." "Don't excite yourself," he said coolly. "Let me get on with my story. When I was a few months old, I began to find the stable yard narrow, and wondered what there was outside of it. I discovered a hole in the garden wall, and used to sneak out night. Oh, what fun it was! I got to know a lot of street dogs, and we had gay times, barking under people's windows and making them mad, and getting into backyards and chasing cats. We used to kill a cat nearly every night. Policemen would chase us, and we would run and run till the water just ran off our tongues, and we hadn't a bit of breath left. Then I'd go home and sleep all day and go out again the next night. When I was about a year old, I began to stay out days as well as nights. They couldn't keep me home. Then I ran away for 3 months. I got with an old lady on Fifth Avenue who was very fond of dogs. She had 4 white poodles, and her servants used to wash them and tie up their hair with blue ribbons, and she used to take them for drives in her phaeton in the park, and they wore gold and silver collars. The biggest poodle wore a ruby in his collar worth $500. I went driving too, and sometimes we met my master. He often smiled and shook his head at me. I heard him tell the coachman one day that I was a little blackguard, and he was to let me come and go as I liked. "If they had whipped you soundly," I said, "it might have made a good dog of you." "I'm good enough now," said Dandy airily. "The young ladies who drove with my master used to say that it was priggish and tiresome to be too good. To go on with my story, I stayed with Mrs. Judge Tibbet till I got sick of her fussy ways. She made a simpleton of herself over those poodles. Each one had a high chair at the table, and a plate, and they always sat in these chairs and had meals with her, and the servants all called them Master Bijou, and Master Tot, and Miss Tiny, and Miss Fluff. One day they tried to make me sit in a chair, and I got cross and bit Mrs. Tibbet, and she beat me cruelly, and her servants stoned me away from the house." "Speaking about fools, Dandy," I said, "if it is polite to call a lady one, I should say that that lady was one. Dogs shouldn't be put out of their place. Why didn't she have some poor children at her table and in her carriage, and let the dogs run behind? Easy to see you don't know New York," said Dandy with a laugh. "Poor children don't live with the rich old ladies. Mrs. Tibbet hated children anyway. Then dogs like Poodles would get lost in the mud or killed in the crowd if they ran behind a carriage. Only knowing dogs like me can make their way about." I rather doubted this speech, but I said nothing, and he went on patronizingly. "However, Joe, thou hast reason, as the French say. Mrs. Judge Tibbet didn't give her dogs exercise enough. Their claws were as long as Chinamen's nails, and the hair grew over their pads, and they always had red eyes and were always sick, and she had to dose them with medicine and call them her poor little weeny teeny sicky wicky doggies. Blah! I got disgusted with her. When I left her, I ran away to her niece's, Miss Ball's. She was a sensible young lady, and she used to scold her aunt for the way in which she brought up her dogs. She was almost too sensible, for her pug and I were rubbed and scrubbed within an inch of our lives, and had to go for such long walks that I got thoroughly sick of them. A woman, whom the servants called Trotsey, came every morning and took the pug and me by our chains, and sometimes another dog or two, and took us for long tramps in quiet streets. That was Trotsey's business, to walk dogs, and Miss Ball got a great many fashionable young ladies who could not exercise their dogs, to let Trotsey have them, and they said that it made a great difference in the health and appearance of their pets. Trotsey got 15 cents an hour for a dog. Goodness, what appetites those walks gave us! And didn't we make the dog biscuits disappear? But it was a slow life at Miss Ball's. We only saw her for a little while every day. She slept till noon. After lunch she played with us a little while in the greenhouse. Then she was off driving or visiting, and in the evening she always had company, or went to a dance, or to the theater. I soon made up my mind that I'd run away. I jumped out of a window one fine morning and ran home. I stayed there for a long time. My mother had been run over by a cart and killed, and I wasn't sorry. My master never bothered his head about me, and I could do as I liked. One day, when I was having a walk and meeting a lot of dogs that I knew, a little boy came behind me, and before I could tell what he was doing, he had snatched me up and was running off with me. I couldn't bite him, for he had stuffed some of his rags in my mouth. He took me to a tenement house in a part of the city that I had never been in before. He belonged to a very poor family. My faith, weren't they badly off? 6 children and a mother and father, all living in 2 tiny rooms. Scarcely a bit of meat did I smell while I was there. I hated their bread and molasses, and the place smelled so badly I thought I should choke. They kept me shut up in their dirty rooms for several days, and the brat of a boy that caught me slept with his arm around me at night. The weather was hot, and sometimes we couldn't sleep, and they had to go up on the roof. After a while, they chained me up in a filthy yard at the back of the house, and there I thought I should go mad. I would have liked to bite them all to death if I had dared. It's awful to be chained, especially for a dog like me that loves his freedom. The flies worried me, and the noises distracted me, and my flesh would fairly creep from getting no exercise. I was there nearly a month, while they were waiting for a reward to be offered. But none came, and one day the boy's father, who was a street peddler, took me by my chain and led me about the streets till he sold me. A gentleman got me for his little boy, but I didn't like the look of him, so I sprang up and bit his hand, and he dropped the chain, and I dodged boys and policemen, and finally got home more dead than alive, and looking like a skeleton. I had a good time for several weeks, and then I began to get restless and was off again. But I'm getting tired. I want to go to sleep. "You're not very polite," I said, "to offer to tell a story and then go to sleep before you finish it. Look out for number 1, my boy." said Dandy with a yawn, "for if you don't, no one else will." And he shut his eyes and was fast asleep in a few minutes. I sat and looked at him. What a handsome, good-natured, worthless dog he was. A few days later, he told me the rest of his history. After a great many wanderings, he happened home one day just as his master's yacht was going to sail, and they chained him up till they went on board, so that he could be an amusement on the passage to Fairport. It was in November that Dandy came to us, and he stayed all winter. He made fun of the Morrises all the time, and said they had a dull, poky old house, and he only stayed because Miss Laura was nursing him. He had a little sore on his back that she soon found out was mange. Her father said it was a bad disease for dogs to have, and Dandy had better be shot, but she begged so hard for his life, and said she would cure him in a few weeks, that she was allowed to keep him. Dandy wasn't capable of getting really angry, but he was as disturbed about having this disease as he could be about anything. He said that he had got it from a little mangy dog that he had played with a few weeks before. He was only with the little dog for a while, and didn't think he would take it, but it seemed he knew what an easy thing it was to get. Until he got well, he was separated from us. Miss Laura kept him up in the loft with the rabbits where we could not go, and the boys ran him around the garden for exercise. She tried all kinds of cures for him, and I heard her say that though it was a skin disease, his blood must be purified. She gave him some of the pills that she had made out of sulphur and butter for Jim and Billy and me, to keep our coats silky and smooth. When they didn't cure him, she gave him a few drops of arsenic every day, and washed the sore, and indeed his whole body, with tobacco water or carbolic soap. It was the tobacco water that cured him. Miss Laura always put on gloves when she went near him, and used a brush to wash him, for if a person takes mange from a dog, they may lose their hair and their eyelashes, but if they are careful, no harm comes from nursing a mangy dog, and I have never known of anyone taking the disease. After a time, Dandy's sore healed, and he was set free. He was right glad, he said, for he had got heartily sick of the rabbits. He used to bark at them and make them angry, and they would run around the loft, stamping their hind feet at him, in the funny way that rabbits do. I think they disliked him as much as he disliked them. Jim and I did not get the mange. Dandy was not a strong dog, and I think his irregular ways of living made him take diseases readily. He would stuff himself when he was hungry, and he always wanted rich food. If he couldn't get what he wanted at the Morrises, he went out and stole or visited the dumps at the back of the town. When he did get ill, he was more stupid about doctoring himself than any dog I have ever seen. He never seemed to know when to eat grass or herbs or a little earth that would have kept him in good condition. A dog should never be without grass. When Dandy got ill, he just suffered till he got well again, and never tried to cure himself of his small troubles. Some dogs even know enough to amputate their limbs. Jim told me a very interesting story of a dog the Morrises once had called Gyp, whose leg became paralyzed by a kick from a horse. He knew the leg was dead, and gnawed it off nearly to the shoulder, and though he was very sick for a time, yet in the end he got well. to return to Dandy. I knew he was only waiting for the spring to leave us, and I was not sorry. The first fine day he was off, and during the rest of the spring and summer, we occasionally met him running about the town with a set of fast dogs. One day I stopped and asked him how he contented himself in such a quiet place as Fairport, and he said he was dying to get back to New York, and was hoping that his master's yacht would come and take him away. Poor Dandy never left Fairport. After all, he was not such a bad dog. There was really nothing vicious about him, and I hate to speak of his end. His master's yacht did not come, and soon the summer was over and the winter was coming, and no one wanted Dandy, for he had such a bad name. He got hungry and cold, and one day sprang upon a little girl to take away a piece of bread and butter that she was eating. He did not see the large house dog on the door sill, and before he could get away, the dog had seized him and bitten and shaken him till he was nearly dead. When the dog threw him aside, he crawled to the Morrises, and Miss Laura bandaged his wounds and made him a bed in the stable. One Sunday morning she washed and fed him very tenderly, for she knew he could not live much longer. He was so weak that he could scarcely eat the food she put in his mouth, so she let him lick some milk from her finger. As she was going to church, I could not go with her, but I ran down the lane and watched her out of sight. When I came back, Dandy was gone. I looked till I found him. He had crawled into the darkest corner of the stable to die, and though he was suffering very much, he never uttered a sound. I sat by him and thought of his master in New York. If he had brought Dandy up properly, he might not now be here in his silent death agony. A young pup should be trained just as a child is, and punished when he does wrong. Dandy began badly, and not being checked in his evil ways, had come to this. Poor Dandy! Poor handsome dog of a rich master! He opened his dull eyes, gave me one last glance, then, with a convulsive shudder, his torn limbs were still. He would never suffer any more. When Miss Laura came home, she cried bitterly to know he was dead. The boys took him away from her and made him a grave in the corner of the garden. Chapter 37. The End of My Story. I have come now to the last chapter of my story. I thought when I began to write that I would put down the events of each year of my life, but I fear that would make my story too long, and neither Miss Laura nor any boys and girls would care to read it. So I will stop just here, though I would gladly go on, for I have enjoyed so much talking over old times that I am very sorry to leave off. Every year that I have been at the Morrises, something pleasant has happened to me, but I cannot put all these things down, nor can I tell how Miss Laura and the boys grew and changed year by year, till now they are quite grown up. I will just bring my tale down to the present time, and then I will stop talking and go lie down in my basket, for I am an old dog now, and get tired very easily. I was a year old when I went to the Morrises, and I have been with them for 12 years. I am not living in the same house with Mr. and Mrs. Morris now, but I am with my dear Miss Laura, who is Miss Laura no longer, but Mrs. Gray. She married Mr. Harry 4 years ago, and lives with him and Mr. and Mrs. Wood on Dingley Farm. Mr. and Mrs. Morris live in a cottage near by. Mr. Morris is not very strong and can preach no longer. The boys are all scattered. Jack married pretty Miss Bessie Drury and lives on a large farm near here. Miss Bessie says that she hates to be a farmer's wife, but she always looks very happy and contented, so I think she must be mistaken. Carl is a merchant in New York, Ned is a clerk in a bank, and Willie is studying at a place called Harvard. He says that after he finishes his studies, he is going to live with his father and mother. The Morrises' old friends often come to see them. Miss Drury comes every summer on her way to Newport, and Mr. Montague and Charlie come every other summer. Charlie always brings with him his old dog Brisk, who is getting feeble like myself. We lie on the veranda in the sunshine and listen to the Morrises talking about old days, and sometimes it makes us feel quite young again. In addition to Brisk, we have a Scotch collie. He is very handsome and is a constant attendant of Miss Laura's. We are great friends, he and I, but he can get about much better than I can. One day, a friend of Miss Laura's came with a little boy and girl, and Collie sat between the two children, and their father took a picture with a Kodak. I like him so much that I told him I would get them to put his picture in my book. When the Morris boys are all here in the summer, we have gay times. All through the winter we look forward to their coming, for they make the old farmhouse so lively. Mr. Maxwell never misses a summer in coming to Riverdale. He has such a following of dumb animals now that he says he can't move them any farther away from Boston than this, and he doesn't know what he will do with them unless he sets up a menagerie. He asked Miss Laura the other day if she thought that the old Italian would take him into partnership. He did not know what had happened to poor Bellini, so Miss Laura told him. A few years ago, the Italian came to Riverdale to exhibit his new stock of performing animals. They were almost as good as the old ones, but he had not quite so many as he had before. The Morrises and a great many of their friends went to his performance, and Miss Laura said afterward that when cunning little Billy came on the stage and made his bow and went through his antics of jumping through hoops and catching balls, that she almost had hysterics. The Italian had made a special pet of him for the Morrises' sake, and treated him more like a human being than a dog. Billy rather put on airs when he came up to the farm to see us, but he was such a dear little dog, in spite of being almost spoiled by his master, that Jim and I could not get angry with him. In a few days they went away, and we heard nothing but good news from them till last winter. Then a letter came to Miss Laura from a nurse in a New York hospital. She said that the Italian was very near his end, and he wanted her to write to Mrs. Gray to tell her that he had sold all his animals but the little dog that she had so kindly given him. He was sending him back to her, and with his last breath he would pray for heaven's blessing on the kind lady and her family that had befriended him when he was in trouble. The next day Billy arrived, a thin, white scarecrow of a dog. He was sick and unhappy, and would eat nothing, and started up at the slightest sound. He was listening for the Italian's footsteps, but he never came. And one day Mr. Harry looked up from his newspaper and said, "Laura Bellini is dead." Miss Laura's eyes filled with tears, and Billy, who had jumped up when he heard his master's name, fell back again. He knew what they meant, and from that instant he ceased listening for footsteps, and lay quite still till he died. Miss Laura had him put in a little wooden box, and buried him in a corner of the garden, and when she is working among her flowers, she often speaks regretfully of him, and of poor Dandy, who lies in the garden at Fairport. Bella, the parrot, lives with Mrs. Morris, and is as smart as ever. I have heard that parrots live to a very great age. Some of them even get to be 100 years old. If that is the case, Bella will outlive all of us. She notices that I am getting blind and feeble, and when I go down to call on Mrs. Morris, she calls out to me,
"Keep a stiff upper lip, Beautiful Joe. Never say die, Beautiful Joe. Keep the game a-going, Beautiful Joe."
Mrs. Morris says she doesn't know where Bella picks up her slang words. I think it is Mr. Ned who teaches her, for when he comes home in the summer, he often says with a sly twinkle in his eye, "Come out into the garden, Bella," and he lies in a hammock under the trees, and Bella perches on a branch near him, and he talks to her by the hour. Anyway, it is in the autumn after he leaves Riverdale that Bella always shocks Mrs. Morris with her slang talk. I am glad that I am to end my days in Riverdale. Fairport was a very nice place, but it was not open and free like this farm. I take a walk every morning that the sun shines. I go out among the horses and cows and stop to watch the hens pecking at their food. This is such a happy place, and I hope my dear Miss Laura will live to enjoy it many years after I am gone. I have very few worries. The pigs bother me a little in the spring by rooting up the bones that I bury in the fields in the fall, but that is a small matter, and I try not to mind it. I get a great many bones here, and I should be glad if I had some poor city dogs to help me eat them. I don't think bones are good for pigs. Then there is Mr. Harry's tame squirrel out in one of the barns that teases me considerably. He knows that I can't chase him now that my legs are so stiff with rheumatism, and he takes delight in showing me how spry he can be, darting around me and whisking his tail almost in my face, and trying to get me to run after him, so that he can laugh at me. I don't think that he is a very thoughtful squirrel, but I try not to notice him. The sailor boy who gave Bella to the Morrises has got to be a large, stout man, and is the first mate of a vessel. He sometimes comes here, and when he does, he always brings the Morrises presents of foreign fruits and curiosities of different kinds. Malta the cat is still living, and is with Mrs. Morris. Davy the rat is gone. So is poor old Jim. He went away one day last summer, and no one ever knew what became of him. The Morrises searched everywhere for him, and offered a large reward to anyone who would find him, but he never turned up again. I think that he felt he was going to die, and went into some out-of-the-way place. He remembered how badly Miss Laura felt when Dandy died, and he wanted to spare her the greater sorrow of his death. He was always such a thoughtful dog, and so anxious not to give trouble. I am more selfish. I could not go away from Miss Laura even to die. When my last hour comes, I want to see her gentle face bending over me, and then I shall not mind how much I suffer. She is just as tender-hearted as ever, but she tries not to feel too badly about the sorrow and suffering in the world, because she says that would weaken her, and she wants all her strength to try to put a stop to some of it. She does a great deal of good in Riverdale, and I do not think that there is any one in all the country around who is as much beloved as she is. She has never forgotten the resolve that she made some years ago, that she would do all that she could to protect dumb creatures. Mr. Harry and Mr. Maxwell have helped her nobly. Mr. Maxwell's work is largely done in Boston, and Miss Laura and Mr. Harry have to do the most of theirs by writing. For Riverdale has got to be a model village in respect of the treatment of all kinds of animals. It is a model village not only in that respect, but in others. It has seemed as if all other improvements went hand in hand with the humane treatment of animals. Thoughtfulness toward lower creatures has made the people more and more thoughtful toward themselves, and this little town is getting to have quite a name through the state for its good schools, good society, and good business and religious standing. Many people are moving into it to educate their children. The Riverdale people are very particular about what sort of strangers come to live among them. A man who came here 2 years ago and opened a shop was seen kicking a small kitten out of his house. The next day, a committee of Riverdale citizens waited on him and said they had a great deal of trouble to root out cruelty from their village, and they didn't want anyone to come there and introduce it again, and they thought he had better move on to some other place. The man was utterly astonished, and said he'd never heard of such particular people. He had had no thought of being cruel. He didn't think that the kitten cared, but now when he turned the thing over in his mind, he didn't suppose cats liked being kicked about any more than he would like it himself, and he would promise to be kind to them in the future. He said, too, that if they had no objection, he would just stay on, for if the people there treated dumb animals with such consideration, they would certainly treat human beings better, and he thought it would be a good place to bring up his children. Of course they let him stay, and he is now a man who is celebrated for his kindness to every living thing, and he never refuses to help Miss Laura when she goes to him for money to carry out any of her humane schemes. There is one most important saying of Miss Laura's that comes out of her years of service for dumb animals that I must put in before I close. And it is this. She says that cruel and vicious owners of animals should be punished. But to merely thoughtless people, don't so much. Don't go to them and say, don't overfeed your animals, and don't starve them, and don't overwork them, and don't beat them, and so on through the long list of hardships that can be put upon suffering animals, but say simply to them, be kind, make a study of your animal's wants, and see that they are satisfied. No one can tell you how to treat your animal as well as you should know yourself, for you are with it all the time, and know its disposition, and just how much work it can stand, and how much rest and food it needs, and just how different it is from every other animal. If it is sick or unhappy, you are the one to take care of it, for nearly every animal loves its own master better than a stranger, and will get well quicker under his care. Miss Laura says that if men and women are kind in every respect to their dumb servants, they will be astonished to find out how much happiness they will bring into their lives, and how faithful and grateful their dumb animals will be to them. Now I must really close my story. Goodbye to the boys and girls who may read it. And if it is not wrong for a dog to say it, I should like to add, God bless you all. If in my feeble way I have been able to impress you with the fact that dogs and many other animals love their masters and mistresses, and live only to please them, my little story will not be written in vain. My last words are, boys and girls, be kind to dumb animals, not only because you will lose nothing by it, but because you ought to, for they were placed on the earth by the same kind hand that made all living creatures. End of Beautiful Joe. This has been a LibriVox recording by Allison Hester.